So, hello world, and warm welcome to our today's event. First, we would like to do warm to this our event, and because of that, from wherever you live, please let us send to you a little global welcome. Welkomst, svagat, bienvenue, willkommen, hoş amadet, svatam, bienvenidos, merhaban, benvenuto, hoş gelmişsiniz, kalosaurisma, hoş geldiniz, welcome. I'm a little bit copycat in that point. Sorry because of this. I am Eylül from Rethinking Economics Members Council, and today as your moderator. Also, I'm joined by my wonderful teammate, Thais Real, as Economics Education Lead of the Rethinking Economics, and today she will support us about the throughout the session about the technical issues or something like this. If you need some technical assistance, you can write on your chat to solve this. Yeah. Why we are in there today? We come together to explore the possible integrate dance between the consulting practices and the development strategies through the lens of the neocolonialism. And as a team, we are honored to have the two incredible political economists who will offer deep and fresh perspectives on this critical discussion. From one side, representing the consulting side, we have Rosie Collington from Copenhagen Business School. And I'm sure that you are familiar with her brilliant work, the econ, co-authored with the Mariana Mazzucato. Welcome, Rosie. And on the development side, we are delighted to welcome Subri Kesar from South of London, whose insightful work, I'm sure that you are also familiar with this, the colonial origins of economics with Ingrid Harold Klangraven and Debbie Kadat, continues to shape our important discussions in this field. So welcome, Subri. And now we will start with the presentations of our speakers. Then we will have a panel discussions, and we will finish with the Q&A sessions for this event. So, shall we have a dance? Before at that point, before starting with the presentations, we have one fundamental questions about to see your experience with only one or two words about development. And after that, we will begin today's conversation with Subri. Okay, so. If you answer the questions, the floor is yours for Subri.
Okay, great. Should I dive into it?
Yes, of course.
Perfect. All right. I'm going to start by sharing my screen. Okay, here we are. So basically, what Eliel and Thais told us about was to talk about that there are consultants and there is AJR, Acemoglu, Johnson Robinson, who walk into a bar and they're having a conversation, and apparently you were all very confused about the conversation that they had, and Rosie and I are here supposed to be unpacking it. So we're very excited to be a part of this conversation, but I'm not sure to what extent we'll be able to unpack it, but let's try nonetheless. So this is the cue that I'm going to begin with and frame the conversation in this way. All right. So they're dressed in sharp academic attire, discussing economic institutions. They walk into the bar. This is the AI-generated image that we have. They overhear four towering consultants in sleek suits, each exuding confidence and expertise. The bartender, a wise-looking figure with glasses, raises an eyebrow as they approach. The neon sign hangs in the bar, which reads, "Institutions matter." At the government and international institutions, just right next door, there's a music that's playing.
I'm looking for a man in finance. Trust fund. Sign, their eyes. Finance. Trust fund.
So you get the sense of what's basically going on in the room, right? So overhearing these consultants, the economists laugh at them and basically saying that, look, you're very ill-equipped to handle the problem of development. And Rosie will, of course, talk to us about how they are ill-equipped, what happens, but sort of just summarizing from, something from the book and also works of Daniela Gabor, the book by Mariana Mazzucato and Rosie Collington. Consultants, the economists at this point are saying that they say that consultants bring about development and privatizing development in the global south, and that's an issue because there's a lack of expertise with the intervention set, because many of the times they would very much stay within their pre-given frameworks, which one is not critically assessing. And that also often leads to a hollowing out of the state capacity. It does a risk transfer to the state, and it often also just privatizes public goods. So academics in that sense might actually be better placed to deal with this problem because they've been trained to think more critically about existing policy. They have access to analytical tools and frameworks to look at the macro pictures. They are able to drive out of a very cost-benefit approach and not just profit-driven, as many of the private firms, consultancy firms would be. Well, there is some truth to it. Me as the narrator sort of stepping back from this conversation tells you that, for example, in India, we used to have what was called the Planning Commission of India, which used to come up with 5-year plans, thinking about long-term development policy, big industrialization, and questions like that for the Indian economy. But past 10 years, the government has sort of done away with, and it has replaced it with this organization that depends a lot on consultancy industry, for example, how to divest from big infrastructure projects, how to basically extract state from it. One of the recent airlines company that used to actually be profit-making, but then the government stopped investing in it, and the big, firms one of the big consultancy firms had to come in and basically help divest it. So those are the kind of problems in which state has moved towards. So there is truth to it. But hearing that, the bartender who's behind the bar starts smiling at the economist. And he says, or she says, or they say, well, while I agree with you, but let's not pretend that your approach is a lot better for the people in the global south. So this is like the conversation happening with AJR. Not all economists are like that, and we can get into a discussion about it. But the economist, of course, gets very animated and angry and says, what? How could you say that? The bartender says, look, don't get me wrong. I'm not an anti-intellectual person, quite the contrary. But your specific approaches to institutions is quite myopic and Eurocentric and does not do the global south much good. In fact, in many ways, it might align with what the consultancy firms might even be doing. So the economist, in this case, the AJR, those in tweed jackets, how do you mean? We specifically showed colonialism had persistent impacts via the type of institutions colonialism created. So they continue, these economists, they say that considering 500 years of colonial history, sustained economic growth, and prosperity can be attributed to what they refer to as inclusive institutions. And these include market-supporting institutions in their framework, like protection of private property, contract enforcement, etc. And these institutions, according to them, have characterized Western Europe as well as the Western European settler economies. On the other hand, they say, are the extractive institutions that enable rent-seeking, expropriation due to legacies of extractive colonialism that hinders development in the global south. So in their framework, it is this inclusive extractive dichotomy of institutions which is the reason for why certain countries were able to develop and other countries were not. And in that sense, almost colonialism or a non-settler colonialism of the kind were related with these extractive institutions, while capitalism, where it progressed, was something that was aligned with inclusive institutions. So the bartender says, hold my beer. pun intended, and says, look, no, I think you're wrong. I recently read this article by, okay, I don't know why I'm doing this, but basically me, Ingrid, and Devika, we wrote this article about the colonial origins of economics, critiquing them, because of which we were invited to speak here, where, they show us that AJR's theory is actually Eurocentric. So let's unpack for you what is Eurocentrism, the bartender says to the economists. And Eurocentrism, as they describe it in this article, is the idea where a partial understanding of how capitalism developed in the global north is placed at the locus or the center of our theories. Why is that imagination partial? Because it does not consider the constitutive role of colonialism in it. It's almost seen as, look, there was endogenous development driven by industrialization, productivity, rationality that led to development in the global north. Not only that, this partial vision is sort of placed at the center of the development projects for the global south, where the argument becomes, you can develop. It's almost like underdeveloped countries that are at older stage of development, where the now developed countries at some point were. And all you need to do is kind of follow the same path by basically having the right kind of policies, institutions, etc., in order to be able to undergo the development that global north does. Of course, that's partial because of various reasons. So there are three ways in which we recognize a Eurocentrism in AJR's theory. First of all, they treat colonialism as a discrete external shock to the trajectories of endogenous domestic institutional development. So as if, there was this discrete shock and this led to two institutions developing in various different ways. However, what they kind of seem to not be taking into account is that underdevelopment that happened in the global south, which are seen as the outcome of the failed cases of capitalist transition and lack of good institutions, is not something that happened in vacuum. And the good institutions in the global north, so-called good institutions, which we'll question, did not happen in the vacuum. It neglects that capitalism as a process developed in a way such that it was simultaneously creating one kind of institutions in the global north and the other kind of institutions in the global south. So what, dependency frameworks and others would say, this is not a stagist view, this is not a teleological view, but rather both these conditions are simultaneously produced through a common process of capitalist expansion in a global scale. Right? So what were the extractive institutions that were helping these so-called inclusive institutions to come up in the global north? Racialization, destruction of artisan economies, development of extractive mining and plantation economies, which they'll call extractive institutions. They were not just extractive institutions that come into being. They were brought into place for these quote-unquote good institutions and capitalist development to develop in the global north. So unevenness on a global scale, which produced this development underdevelopment dichotomy, was brought out of a common process of capitalism's global unfolding, which was supported by colonialism. Second reason how AJR's framework is Eurocentrism, what AJR deem as inclusive institutions, which according to them are property rights, which helps protect against dispossessions, etc., is actually neglects the violent and uneven processes through which those institutions were brought about. For example, when for the first time land titling system comes in India under British colonialism, a lot of people from marginalized caste backgrounds who did not have access to, literate contracts for land actually had to lose all ownership of the land. Similarly, when there's a lot of land that might not be common lands, is not something that exists. Great. So common lands is not something that exists within the purview of market exchange. And many a times the fact that the land remains common actually helps remain in the hands of various communities that might be depending on this land. And the moment it's brought within market transaction, in a market where powers are not equal, those with big multinational companies are actually able to forcibly, under market contracts, so to say, are able to take away land from these people. Similarly, after the formal end of apartheid in South Africa, the whole idea was that there was no big land redistribution that happened because of this upholding of private property rights that we've sort of come to be. And that has been one of the big reasons why inequality also exists in South Africa today. So these instances are far cry from the notion that private property rights in some way are a protection from expropriation and coercion, because they were very much developed on it. Third way in which this article says that AJR is Eurocentric is this view of development as a very techno-bureaucratic process of policy fixes. It depoliticizes the entire idea of capitalist development. The ultimate lesson from their work is, look, Anglo-American political institutions are historically unique and should be universalized in order to support capitalist development globally. And the general understanding is that you can simply import institutions from the global north and the problem is fixed because, you're just at a different stage. Afghanistan, a classic case where different powers in the world tried to come in and import their institutions and try to bring about development, for us is a stark case of where the country stands today and the ruins in which it was left, of how the process is not simply about getting the right person imposing the right institution. They're embedded in political and social dynamics and brought out of it, and therefore needs to be understood in this way. So despite their attempt to integrate history and colonialism, AJR's framework actually remains ahistoric and Eurocentric. And it's not just about AJR. The whole enterprise that has come to being of doing development from both mainstream and also many critical perspective remains very embedded in this Eurocentric nation. It's not simply about getting Eurocentrism wrong. It's about basically getting the dynamics of development in capitalism wrong. So at this point, when we're sort of ending our story, one of the works that I'm developing with Snehashish Bhattacharya is that any project of development that you see treats development and underdevelopment as two stages of history, of course, apart from the radical political economy framework, where development can either be brought about through macro structural interventions to facilitate structural transformation, or, in order to facilitate a capitalist transition, or the idea is, look, there's an inchoate capitalism that exists everywhere, where individual behaviors or institutions need to be corrected, as in the AJR case, the correction of institutions, or in the case of Duflo and Banerjee, the last Nobel, that need to be corrected to align with the capitalist logic. However, the point that we're trying to make here is that capitalist development and capitalist underdevelopment is simultaneously produced. Given the lack of this acknowledgement, much of development becomes financialized and privatized as if we have a script of development. You can add behavioral interventions to it or institutions to it, but there is a path of what has to be followed. And then the way state and international interventions come in is basically just to take care of the casualties of the development process that are not incorporated. What that takes today in the forms of the entire enterprise of development is microcredit programs, loans, basic income, so on and so forth, which rather than facilitating a social and economic inclusive process, becomes just a project of governance of the poor, as Sanyal called it. So we end the story where there's a SOAS or a rethinking econ student walks in, and this is a SOAS bar, how ChatGPT visualized it, overhears this and contributes, saying, while yes, the consultants are robbing the global south, but so are the academics who remain embedded in a very global north-centric frameworks, as in AJR, often suggesting a blanket of policies without any salient understanding of the global south. Similarly, what we see in terms of publishing reports, being parts of the expert panels in economies of the global south, often with no or little expertise. And those two are the ones we would probably put together in conversation in that bar, and we need a critique much more from the outside to think about what is the commonality of it. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Rosie, over to you.
Thank you, Subri, for your clarifications and about the redesigned the story of the in the bar from the SOAS. And yeah, now we will jump into the Rosie, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll just have a go at sharing my slides. And thank you, Sobi. That was an amazing presentation. I don't think I'm going to be able to do justice following up on it. But I've also beginning with this idea of 3 economics Nobel winners and a group of big 3 consultants walk into a bar. So I should say at the outset, I'm not representing the consultants, unfortunately. I've done a lot of research on consultants, but I don't work for them, and don't plan to anytime soon or ever. But what I will be talking about today comes out of research that I did, that ended up in this book called The Big Con. This is the snazzy US version of it. Oh, is my camera on? I'm not sure it is. Is my camera on?
Yes, it is.
Okay, yeah, that's great. I just can't see it. This is the US version, or the US version of The Big Con: How the Consulting Industry Weakens Our Businesses, Infantilizes Our Governments, and Warps Our Economies. And we have a chapter in the book where we talk about the history of consulting, and where it came from. And what I'll be talking about today is very much how it has how the expansion and development of the consulting industry, and of the large firms in particular, have been intrinsically related to the development and expansion of capitalism in the global economy, and how consultants have also been active agents in promoting particular forms of capitalist economic development around the world, often on behalf of, or on behalf of, other institutions as well. So that's quite important. So I'll talk a bit about that today. So let's meet the consultants then. So hopefully everyone has met AJR, or understands who the consultants are going to meet and hang out with. We focus in this book on, or we focused in The Big Con on, these companies in particular. So they are collectively known as the Big Four on the one side. So these are companies that historically have had their roots in accounting and auditing services, and they're kind of globally dominant in that area, but gradually, for various reasons that I won't go into today, expanded also into providing advisory services. So that's Deloitte, Ernst & Young, or EY, KPMG, and PwC. And then these other companies, which are known as the Big Three within this world: Bain & Company, McKinsey & Company, and Boston Consulting Group. So these are not necessarily household names, but I'm sure that many people in our virtual room today are familiar with these companies. Now, there are lots of other types of consulting firms that we talk about in the book. We define consultancies, or the consultancies that we focus on in the book are, as I said, these larger companies. But we do focus in the book on companies that are, or organizations, entities that are structurally dependent on providing advisory services for their growth and survival. So we recognize that many of these dynamics might also, certainly some academic departments could be considered a type of consultancy within this kind of definition, and as we also talk about in the book, academics are often brought in to provide advice, or their kind of knowledge is leveraged or wielded by these companies as well, in various different ways. But generally, we're focusing on companies that have or rely on kind of continuing to get contracts from different clients across the private sector, government, multilateral development banks, and other kind of international organizations, for their kind of survival and growth. And the scale of the profits they get are generally not comparable to even the NGO sector, and certainly not in academia, which is not to suggest that as I said, some of these kind of dynamics, harmful dynamics that I'll talk about today, don't exist in those areas, but they just operate under a slightly different business model. So yes, the 5 types of consultancies that we kind of talk about most in the book are these, the Big Three, the strategy consultancies: McKinsey, Boston Consulting Group, and Bain & Company. So they emerged, or this was a kind of a group of consultancies that emerged really in the early 1900s with the emergence of what became known as scientific management and cost accounting. So I'll talk about that in a minute. Accounting companies, IT companies, and then but particularly in Anglo-Saxon economies in the UK, Australia, and in North America, these outsourcing companies, which includes Serco and Sodexo. You may have noticed them around campus if you're based in London, and then also these kind of smaller specialist companies that have exploded in number around the world ever since really the 2000s, but have existed forever. So why is it even important to kind of think about consulting or these companies and management consulting as a significant sector or something that's worth paying any attention to? Well, really because the scale and scope of the market for consulting services has exploded. It's always been there, but we think it's kind of increasingly important to pay attention to it because it has grown a lot. So just to kind of just to give you kind of an indication of the size or how quickly this sector has grown. And we don't have, for various reasons that we also talk about in the book, it is impossible to get accurate figures, even when you try to kind of adopt a narrower definition of what constitutes a management consultancy. It is pretty difficult to get an accurate figure on how big the market is for all sorts of reasons that have to do, and again, we talk about these in the book, that have to do with the particular types of corporate governance structure that they're allowed to operate under. So they're not publicly traded companies, they're not mandated to disclose much information at all about where they operate, how they operate, who their clients are. And this sort of thing, and also because they are, as one of my colleagues, Silas Stausholm, has documented with Richard Murphy, they also are very active in the world of tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions. So we have no real idea we have no accurate idea how big the market is. But what we can say is that it has grown a lot. And that we have indicative figures that suggest it is very, very big. I think the last figure that I saw from a market research company suggested it's actually worth over $1 trillion globally now. So it's a pretty big sector of the global economy. In terms of the geography, so where do these companies operate? Well, they are operating globally. The Big Four have offices in 130 countries. They employ around 400,000 people. But still 96% of consulting revenues come from North America and Europe. 70% of fees worldwide are generated by just five countries. So that's the USA, Canada, UK, France, and Germany. But these figures alone, again, don't really tell us much about the kind of influence of these companies in other parts of the world. So the fastest growing markets at the time that we were doing research for the book, at least, were in quote unquote developing countries or lower income countries in Africa and Asia, where we actually find that and we found this historically, that these companies will provide services or bid for contracts, for example, from both companies but also governments within these regions at rates that are kind of far below market rates. They'll often work for free in new markets because they view this as a way of getting a foot in the door and then being able to expand their service areas as these forms of economic growth that AJR are so keen to promote. The kind of hope historically of many of these larger firms has been that once those forms of capitalist economic development take off, that there'll be plenty of opportunity for them to kind of provide and sell their services. So they often will be selling or will be providing contracts kind of at rates and for fees that are much lower than in North America and Europe. And they're also extensively contracted in international organizations, so including UN agencies, the WHO. You know, I had a friend who wanted to work for the UN and was told the best way to work for the UN is to get a job for this consultancy, because they were getting a lot of contracts for the UN agency that she was interested in working for, right? So that wasn't career advice, by the way, but this was at least anecdotally what I've been told, and we certainly see them working across lots of different international organizations as well. So what do multinational consultancies, again focusing on these very large companies, what do they know about capitalist development? Well, what we show in the book is that really the history of consulting is the history of capitalist development and the history of capitalist development in the period, or at least since the late 1900s, right? So there is another way of telling the history of the consulting industry, which goes back to, or that might also look at the emergence of public-private relationships. So how, you know, the British colonial state, for example, depended fundamentally on the contracting of private companies for as its literal foot soldiers in places like India and many other parts of the world, right? So this is one history. If we focus on these firms that are now globally dominant, we really see them emerge at the end of the second industrial revolution with the emergence of consultant engineers. So they were engineers that companies contracted, or manufacturing companies contracted on an ad hoc basis, and eventually these engineers formed their own companies and would contract their services out to different companies. What we saw over the next century, half century, was that many groups of these kind of independent consultants would work to kind of promote or spread new business ideas, new business fads often, and quote unquote more efficient forms of production, like Taylorism, and this began really in North America and Western Europe, but quickly spread to other parts of the world, particularly after the Second World War, with welfare state developments and the growth of multi-divisional firms, where really what we saw was, sorry. Okay, 5 minutes left. Yeah, oh, probably less than that now. But yes, really we saw as these kind of as global capitalism spread around the world, consultancies were pretty intrinsic in helping to promote. And I'll just skip to this bit here. So this in terms of their reach in the global south, which I think was one of the questions we had today, this became particularly important from the 1980s. So, and again, many of you will be familiar with this kind of history. Many countries around the world were facing what was known as sovereign default. They were forced to turn to the IMF and the World Bank for loans. And these creditors set very strict conditions through structural adjustment programs in order to be able to access these loans. And so what we saw when we were looking at these kind of historical contracts from these institutions, from these lenders, was that governments were often kind of advised to contract management consultants to design and manage the implementation of structural adjustment programs. And in fact, this was often a condition of the loans. So I have some examples here. So this one from a contract that to Guinea-Bissau, and also in Nigeria and Mexico here. So Nigeria, for example, was forced to take a loan from the World Bank worth $452 million in 1987, and a condition of its structural adjustment program included efforts to limit government spending, downsize the public sector, improve the management of publicly owned assets, improve allocations to infrastructure and social sectors, and rely more on market forces. Again, all things that AJR and their ACA that their or their friends might also think were important. And the government established the Technical Committee on Privatization and Commercialization by decree to oversee the privatization of 110 state-owned enterprises staffed by professionals from the private sector, so across lots of different professional groups. And again, we also saw kind of similar patterns in Mexico. And these are just a few examples where companies like McKinsey and Booz Allen were pretty fundamental and instrumental in preparing sales prospectuses for bank privatizations. So what the kind of history of the consulting industry tells us, again, focusing on where these firms emerged and how they spread around the world, is that there has as we describe it in the book, they have ridden the waves of capitalism as capitalism has sought out, as global capitalism or capitalist economic development has sought out new markets, new geographical markets, but also new sectors. And this relates to what we're seeing today in areas like artificial intelligence, critical minerals, COVID-19, green hydrogen, the kind of latest the latest kind of hype area in renewable technologies, reshoring, ESG investments. What we've seen is that every time that these new areas emerge, consultancies, these large multinational firms have been very successful in creating new service areas that enable them to also be active in that enable them to not only, you know, kind of promote or kind of entrench these forms of development, but also in the process become part of that process. So this was just an example. So what would they be discussing? I think from the perspective of the consultancies, they'd be just very interested to hear how much of what the theories of AJR and the findings of AJR implied for them in terms of the opportunities to create new service areas and enter into new markets and expand into new markets. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Rosie. That's the excellent presentations today and really open-minded about the structure. So we can also expecting the questions from the attendees. But before that, thank you for the answers for the introduction questions, the other polling questions for the attendees. Now, I have a little bit questions about the clarifying of the structure. And yeah, generally, especially after the Nobel Prize, we literally, especially from Turkey, I'm based on, heard about some kind of the importance of the prize, and we see that now the importance showing open the new pathway to think about the rethinking the development structure and can find the alternative ways about that. So especially I would like to start with the Supri's presentation because it was excellent to think about some cases about the Afghanistan example to transferring the development side. But when thinking about especially you answered with your presentation, but could you please tell us from your side, AJR's theory explain that the global inequality, or we should take this theory as a really superficial or oversimplified in that point?
Thanks, Elul. And thanks, Rosie, for the very exciting and interesting presentation. So just kind of talking about how AJR would think about global inequality. And for them, the idea that in certain countries there were inclusive institutions and the fact that they weren't in other countries kind of describes why certain countries are rich and poor, why certain countries saw high growth versus not high growth, sort of a thing. So it's sort of assumed that, look, it's the problem of institutions. I think we need to keep in mind that when new institutional economics as a paradigm comes into being in economics around the 1970s with the works of Douglas North and then AJR, they are in fact quite interesting because for the first time, economics, which is not taking institutions seriously, which by the way, other disciplines had been taking for the longest of times, it was the first time that they in fact started talking about it in a serious manner, which I think is a really good development, right? But then that's where it stops. The problem or the Eurocentrism or the colonial origins of economics are such that they almost always have their framework which doesn't take into account the dynamics of capitalism's development on a global scale in mind. So it is almost always put in that there's global north, they are rich and they are whatever, because let's say they have their good institutions, because they had industrialization, productivity growth, etc. Everybody else is only seen in respect to it, with respect to it, as a lack or what is lacking. So what is lacking is basically you don't have the institutions that can help capitalist expansion and growth happen in the way that it happened in global north. And that's where institutions become a part of the story as well, rather than thinking about that, look, the processes that we are saying we need to facilitate, for example, growth, etc. Let me give you a simple example. Even if you forget about this in a global context, sure, we know about colonialism and imperialism, which allow for, underdevelopment to be created in one part of the country as it's producing development in the other country. But even think about the dynamics within a particular country, right? Within a particular country as well, and within global north, how did development happen? And how does it happen in today's countries in the global south as well? Usually, we are moving towards okay, so let's think about this process wherein the growth needs a lot of resources on which people might be dependent on for their traditional livelihoods, through common property resources, through land, through agricultural land, etc. These people are transferred out from these traditional resources to the modern segments of the economy, and these resources are basically being taken away from these people. However, given the very capital intensive nature of production that we've seen, most of these people are actually not absorbed in the modern growing segment of the economy, which is why we see this huge surplus population existing globally across the world, etc. Now, these people who are dispossessed from their traditional livelihoods, but on the same time are not being absorbed in the modern segments of the economy, form what we refer to as the surplus or the excluded population that various people have been talking about, and what we see in terms of huge informality. So what we see here is actually there's dispossession, which is very much a part of this growth and expansion process. So the growth and expansion process is not one way. It is also creating in its wake those other processes of dispossession and expropriation. And those are the processes that we need to keep in mind. The argument that can come from a mainstream, if someone's thinking about these ideas, could be, it's okay, this happens, but over time, these people get absorbed as wage workers. I'm not too convinced, and a lot more empirical work is needed to be done on that. Because first, during period of colonialism, actually that population was not absorbed. We see huge populations from Europe and in other places basically going and settling in other countries. The whole continent of the US of A is basically killing of indigenous communities and going and settling on there, which was all this population. Look at Australia. Like, we basically have all the surplus population going in other countries. In today's world, we are seeing growth happening, but increasingly population becoming redundant, and increasingly people not being employed in a meaningful way in wage labor relationship. In India, 50% of employment is self-employment, which is people who are basically organized production using either just themselves or with household labor without any wage labor relationship. Most of these enterprises do not grow and transition into larger capitalist enterprises. So that is what we are thinking about. So yes, you're right, Aliul. I think there's a very oversimplification of the process, because it's not just about, oh, they're, in whatever way, not understanding the context of the global south. They're not understanding the context of global north growth as well. And that's where the problem lies.
Thank you for the answer. Really, that's the balance between the reality and theory shows in that case always. So thank you for this answer. So Rosie, the other question is for you about the technological side, as you mentioned about the last page of the slide. So yeah, we saw the impact of the artificial intelligence in these days, mostly in all the fields, and especially the consultancy includes in there. And from your side, is it possible to see that the consulting structure, along with the technological developments, can be part of a solution of the problems created by the neocolonial perspective, as we discussed?
Yeah, that's a great big question. I also just wanted to kind of echo what, or to respond to what Sobi said as well. You know, I think this is something that the consultancies, these big multinational firms would have in common with AJR, that they also ignore these processes of expropriation of people and land, and resources and collective resources in their work. And you know, we've seen this when they talk about inclusive institution building as well, or in things like ESG and what this means, you know, and kind of trying to encourage, on the one hand, trying to or provide services to governments to develop national climate strategies, for example, or providing companies with environmental social governance frameworks that they can use to assess their the gender balance of their board, or whatever, while at the same time providing advice to oil and gas companies that enable them to you know, access permitting, or navigate permitting processes so that they can continue exploring and drilling in the planet. So I think that that's something that is you know, ignored within also the kind of frameworks that these companies use, that consultancies use, when they are trying to take stock of how good their practices are for the planet and for people, right? There is a selective memory, or a selective kind of thinking process going on, where these processes of expropriation and exclusion are omitted. So do I think that that there is that the emergence of new technologies and consultancies hold potential to challenge some, or might provide tools for challenging some of the kind of harmful things that we've seen? You know, I'm not anti-technology. I always think that there is potential for different types of technologies and other kind of infrastructures to be able to used in ways that are not actively harmful. But you know, we have to think about the ownership structure, like who is owning these technologies at the moment, right? How what is the process of developing, for example, AI, or the technological infrastructures, the hardware on which AI is currently being built, and you know, these rely on very extractive processes of mineral or rely on minerals extraction in parts of the world, that to be able to develop these or build these data centers that are necessary for AI to function, right? So I would say I'm not optimistic about it. Yes. And fundamentally, do I think that consultancies, and again, I'm focusing on the big three and the big four, I think that there are other we call at the end of the book to try to expand our definition of what counts as, you know, consulting advice, or what counts as good advice, right? So the default, the status quo default has been that when a government has a challenge, when a company has a problem, and particularly we see this in governments and in international organizations, then they bring in the consultants, they bring in Deloitte for advice. Now what about if you know, other actors were brought in that did not have these same kind of imperatives, these same business models, but that functioned according to, you know, different logics and had different interests and kind of more genuine expertise? So these could be, for example, trade union organizations, sources of advice that came from, or expertise that came from communities themselves. In that situation, I think that certainly kind of ecosystems of knowledge and expertise are critical to be able to find alternatives. But insofar as many of the alternatives or the solutions that are needed to kind of challenge or confront what we already have are not profitable, I don't think that we're going to find the existing companies that dominate the consulting industry particularly interested in providing those forms of knowledge.
Thank you so much for the answers. Yes, that's the interesting point of the relation between international organizations with the consultancy firms. And that reminds me that one of the examples in the econ, which was about the health service in the UK, and the period, I'm sorry, was really shocking because it was the Labour Party leader in that time. So what's the assuming of the consultancy firms' decisions, but what was the reality of the consequences for the UK in that time? So thank you for this answer. That was really insightful about the think about again in the structure. And I have two more questions about this, and after that, we will jump into the Q&A session. But before that, I'm stuck with the Afghanistan example about this structure, and because we have seen always different kind of the examples now in this political crisis, and using these terms generally, especially for the economists, should be really how can I say that, sensitive and crucial what they're talking about. And yeah, in these days, in your perspective, what kind of the economies with this with thinking about political crisis, what kind of the economies or economic development to these consultants promote for the global south? Because, for example, AGR promotes for the institutions, good institutions in that case, but after the Nobel Prize, we saw some elections, not only for the USA, but also all around the world. We came across with this kind of the political crisis. So how do you think that this impacts democracy or the understanding of the democracy?
Sorry, is this question for me?
Yes, for both of you, if you would like to answer, that's open.
Right. Okay, I think whenever this question comes about democracy, I get into this existential question of what is democracy? Are we living in a democracy even now or not? Is one vote per one person where there's such huge inequalities? Can that be, systematically classified as democracy? So keeping all those caveats aside, which I'm very well aware of and makes it a difficult question, I guess we can reflect a bit on the political crisis of today, because in some sense, I think, and Rosie's work is a lot on the state and the role of the state as well, which I'm quite keen to sometime hear about as well. So probably she can speak much more to it. But the way I think about it is that the role of the state itself is undergoing a major transformation. I mean, it's something that's always a negotiating space rather than a pre-given entity. So there's always that negotiation that keeps on happening depending on the state-citizen contract, the capital state contract, so on and so forth, right? So there's always that evolution that is happening. But there has been a lot of discussion, particularly in the last decade, about what role has state taken. Is it something that it has completely become something that is subservient to the interests of monopoly capital or big capital, whether it is, and for the global south, the debate has also been in terms of is it the domestic capital or is it the imperial capital? Which of those two is it subservient to? Or is there today not really much difference between that domestic capital and big capital, because, for example, for countries like India, a lot of big capital will be a part of that international capital as well. So that's something that I kind of want to keep as a framing for us to think about this. One thing that we did see post the 1980s, when even in the global north, there was this globalization, liberalization, and so on and so forth. For example, in the US, we are seeing a period where actually between 40s to 70s post World War II, for various political economy reasons, this period, which is called the global golden age of capitalist accumulation, there's a transfer of productivity increase also to the people. And you see this rise in real wages that is sort of happening. Post 80s, this starts to slow down with the stagnation in real wages. Across the world, you see like an increase in the productivity wage gap. That is all of what is being produced. Much of it is going off as profits and much less in terms of wages. It's not just in terms of absolute numbers, but also in proportions. So whatever growth is happening, someone else is getting a larger share of the pie. That is linked with the way globalization has happened. And the way it happened was that when, let's say, the US capital was like, actually, if we have to keep serving within the domestic bounds, that makes it unprofitable for us. Because you want us to pay the workers a lot more, which is sort of the state citizen contract, where the state wants to maintain this happy workforce in the biggest capitalist economy of the time. So the contract sort of starts to break down as this capital moves across in different parts of the world, where the idea is, okay, we're going to access cheap labor now, increase our profits, etc. That, of course, has an impact for the labor force in the global north as well, where the wages start to stagnate because now they have to compete with a global labor market. Oh, you want higher wages? We're going to shut down plant here. We're going to relocate to India, Ethiopia, China, wherever, Bangladesh, in order to get cheaper wages, right? So in that sense, that state citizen contract that existed in the global north had started to break down because of the role of capital, because the capital wanted to access higher profits. What happened in the global south as a result of it? This was almost celebrated because, now you need to have the good institutions, you need to have the ease of doing business and everything, the sort of indicators that World Bank promoted, in order to precisely attract these sort of investments, which led to worsening working conditions for many people. Of course, the counter argument has been, oh, actually, how can you say that? Because, people prefer this kind of job. But we basically move towards a low equilibrium. Like right now, workers in India, a lot of workers who are working in this tech sector have been, I'm talking about the working class, there has sort of been protesting against big corporate wanting to impose a 60, 70 hours work day, so on and so work week on people. So that is the sort of exploitation that we are talking about. So in some sense, what starts happening in the global south is, with capital becoming more global, certain people starting to get more part of the growth process, there's an increasing inequality that we see. What's happening in the global north is that state citizen contract has sort of, which was a promise, has started to break down because the capital is now being made to move elsewhere in the world in order to get higher profits. What do we see as a result of that? Basically, population in the global north starts to blame every immigrant that they find, every global south country that they find, etc., for the lack of development, for the falling of wages, etc. While it is the capital, we have very good empirical studies showing that actually immigration does not have a negative impact on employment or wages of different, global north countries, and there's very good mainstream labor empirical works on it, and but we tend to blame that because that contract was broken. While in the global south, that is stuck in this cycle where they're all now being pushed into this race to the bottom, where they have to compete just amongst each other in order to attract this foreign investment, because that is the only model of development that is being given to us. So what do we end up doing? Let's decrease our wages, let's not have any labor laws, let's allow for easy dispossession to happen, so that all this capital from the global north comes to our country. I mean, India, let's say, for example, but let's say for any other country, global south country of the world. So basically, the population, global population, labor loses out everywhere in the global north and in the global south. The fact that it is not being resolved within the current system that is why the politics of it has to reinvent different ways of basically blaming the next person that you can find, the minority that you can create within your entity. And then this process keeps happening. It happens in the global north and it happens in the global south, which leads to a crisis of what is democratic today, minority rights, so on and so forth, which is very much a part of this development process that we are talking about here with these real world implications.
Thank you for this amazing answer. And it reminds not only for the structure of India, but also, as you mentioned about that, any country in the global south have similar experiences from different kind of the sectors, different kind of the market distractions or the decisions. So for the last one from my side, I'm really when I watched the slides of the Russi, that was really open-minded that this kind of the history of the consultancy started with global north countries, but it's still limited for them, and it will spread it on the global south countries and growing day by day in that time. So with this frame, I would like to ask you and about this structure, about really relation with development structure. From your side, is there a type of the consultancy practice valuable for global south, which promotes even development, or how it should be if you have a chance to a consultancy practice for the global south country?
Oh, I'm not sure I understand the question. So is there a form of consulting that can promote even development? Is that what you said?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, I'm not sure. It's again, I think if we ask fundamentally, who we like, if we recognize that in again, with all the caveats of what democracy means, right? If we think about what in a nominally democratic government the role of government is to provide the things that its citizens want, right? Or to pursue things that citizens want. Then this begs the question of and if we recognize that they might not always have and we don't necessarily want governments to be so all powerful that they always have the kind of immediate capacity to do everything themselves, and actually working with citizens and them being much more kind of closely embedded with citizens can also be a more democratic way of governments acting, right? If we recognize all of this, then we recognize that, okay, government, we don't, governments need to work, or in theory might need to work with other actors all the time to be able to do the things that citizens want them to do, and that that might also help to prevent the global warming to less than 1.5 degrees Celsius, etc. So the kind of climate and biodiversity goals that we have. And if we recognize that government might need to work with other actors, are these existing consulting companies the right ones for governments to be acting with? I can think of probably few examples where, or if we genuinely had governments that were pursuing green transition pathways, for example, that were genuinely democratically developed and responded to the needs of citizens, I think we would find, and we also recognize that governments didn't necessarily have all the capacities and all the knowledge themselves to be able to pursue these transitions themselves. I think we would find that the existing companies, or the companies that dominate consulting, and perhaps for-profit companies in general are not the best actors to be able to provide this additional capacity, this knowledge, this expertise, this kind of additional capacity to be able to pursue these goals. So I think when we the question really just kind of should force us to question, who is it that's actually should be in the driving seat with or should be in the car if we have democratic governments at the driving seat.
Amazing for the answers. Thank you so much for the for answers and for your time. And we have 4 questions, and I would like to jump into this attendees' questions about that. First, Adham Sahal, thank you for question about that. Said that that's very eye-opening. Did you try to contact with AGR and exchange ideas with? I am also interested in what you think about Duflo, Banerjee, and Kramer's work, who had the previous one of the Nobel Prizes. So yeah.
Great. I can start, and of course, Roji, feel free to jump in at any point. Did we write? No, we did not contact AGR, but we did publish this piece, which actually got quite a bit of traction, much more than what we'd expected earlier. And I'm not sure to what extent they're interested in reading our critiques. It basically says about their whole, winning Nobel for like bringing in institutions and colonialism into economics. We're basically calling their work completely colonial. So yes, I don't know, but I am aware of people writing in ways, and quite mainstream economists trying to see to what extent AGR's thing can be defended against this critique. And as and when those come out, I'd be very happy to engage. And I'm sure my co-authors would be as well. They were kind of great to kind of talk about it. As of now, I'm not sure they're interested to engage with this critique or us. But yeah, in fact, people like Branko Milanovic and a lot of other people, Danny Roderick and others, were talking about this critique and kind of asking what it means, etc. So it was good. But yeah, don't know if it has reached AGR's eyes or ears. Okay, about Banerjee, Duflo, and Kremer. We need another session to talk about that. But one of the co-authors on this piece, Ingrid Kwan-Graben, she's actually written quite a bit on it. But again, the whole project of RCTs can be seen in some ways similar in this project, in the sort of the critique of Eurocentrism that we levied, but also in another way. One thing that's quite distinct about them is that they have sort of moved away from thinking about development as this macro structural phenomenon, which has these ways of looking at different ways of how underdevelopment comes to be about. Rather than from that, it reduces the question of development almost to something, if there's a problem of poverty in a particular borough in London to a particular municipality in India, without taking into account the processes or structure in which it is embedded, the whole question gets reduced to very small micro problems. And the answer is in terms of let's have an intervention to see how those micro problems can be resolved. Again, going back to the dispossession example that I was giving in one of the questions that I was giving as part of one of the questions, there would be a lot of interventions to be like, okay, we're going to give a little bit of cash to someone and sort of try to see, or let's say we give some fertilizers, etc., that increase yield production in a particular village, etc. But what ends up being is like, okay, they would track the individuals over time to see the impact of that intervention, but general equilibrium impacts of those things are not seen. For example, what if everybody was to now get this fertilizer? If you think that it actually helps, that might increase the crop yield so much to decrease, to basically crash prices of crop in a particular area, right? And which is something that we do see because of oversupply of agricultural things that might happen. Second, of course, there have been huge ethical problems with the RCTs in the way that it happens. For example, there was a very nice piece in The Economist, but one of the first villages where Michael Kremer went to do his fieldwork is where a lot of its problems kind of, not problems, a lot of, I think it's a Freudian slip, a lot of his students sort of followed, and basically the same set of villages were re-given interventions of different kinds. So there are like hundreds and hundreds of interventions being given to the same set of people. And it's quite interesting about how that distorts the community dynamics there, how it has escalated inequality there. And there was a very nice sentence in one of the pieces. I'm paraphrasing it, but something along the lines of how people on the other side of village looked at the village across and waited for the the gods of algorithms to smile upon them. And I think that's such a stark capture of who do you decide, how are you affecting the various social dynamics of that place is not thought of. And then, of course, the more important sort of critique of them is also in terms of again, how do they not get the dynamics of development right? You can't think about development even if there's a small development problem. The answer lies in big picture stories of how that poverty is not something that exists out there that you're going to resolve. Poverty is actively created. The fact that we are in a system where things are commodified, where everything is mediated through market exchange, and the fact that we do not have resources that allow us to reproduce our economic and social conditions on their own is the reason why we have poverty. Dispossession brings about poverty. It's not something that just happened to be there. And that conception is sort of completely done away with. Of course, our argument would be that even the older structural macro theories of structural transformation, etc., continue to be quite Eurocentric in the way that we've thought about it. However, with this move towards Banerjee, Kremer, Duflo sort of a thing, it becomes fully colonized, even when they're going to the field, because the idea becomes that these big processes, etc., are not seen as a problem. The problem is you. The problem is you are not behaving like a good capitalist person should. You're not behaving like the good productive worker. Why is their schooling system in India is failing? It's not because the teachers are overworked, because of lack of investment in education. You, the teacher, is not working well. So we're going to have an intervention where we're going to put cameras and see how you work a lot more. We're going to burn you out and prove that it's actually very productive and good for the things. And so the entire act of reducing the problems to that of individuals and how to make the individual's behavior, the way AJR talk about aligning institutions to facilitate capitalist growth. So there should be capitalist institutions, not any other kinds of institutions. Banerjee, Duflo, and Kremer talk about how to change the individual behaviors in order to make them more aligned to the capitalist system. How can I be more rational? Rationality, very strictly defined as capitalist rationality, and how do I act in those ways? So, yeah.
Thank you for the detailed answer. As I guess, the creating the victims always possible for the capitalist system. So I'm jumping into the other question. I think that's for Rosie. What are the potential new service by the four bigs after they master AGR?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they've been trying to master the logics of AJR long before they received the Nobel Prize. Again, there's also been lots of discussion about how not just how kind of novel the ideas and theories of AJR were within there's the insofar as they or perhaps the economic Nobel committee maybe ignored that entire other disciplines of history and entire other approaches to economics and scholarship exist, but also within within the kind of more mainstream economics profession, the kind of ideas that actually states or governments or other types of institutions are also necessary for maintaining or promoting capitalist growth. We also see this in other kind of areas of economics, right? You know, even and this kind of comes back to something Surabhi was saying earlier, that, you know, the state never went away with the election of people like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. Actually, we saw a reconfiguration of what the state was set up to do, which was indeed to develop and kind of have institutions that were beneficial for, or that would help to protect the property rights of enterprises fundamentally, right? And I think, you know, pursuing this logic has been pretty profitable, been pretty lucrative for these dominant consulting companies. So I'm not sure that they would do a lot differently. I don't know if Surabhi would agree, or if I think that, as I mentioned, I think they're constantly, one thing that these companies are very good at is constantly finding new avenues for expansion and accumulation within the kind of structures of the global capitalist system, right? Within its as it is itself reproducing and renewing, the companies or consultancies are very good at finding new ways of creating services to sell to companies and governments within those, so that you know, they're in a constant process of adaptation. Yes. Did you want me to answer the second one as well, which I've just seen?
The second one? No, that's the question for the if they master about the AGR.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Don't worry. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for the awesome answer. And thankful for all the attendees. And the last question from Maria. From her, she said that with the US scaling back its financial and institutional influence in the development sector, do you see this vacuum as an opportunity to foster alternative, less Eurocentric approach? Or does it risk reinforcing other forms of dependency, whether on private consultancy firms, emerging powers like China, or multilateral institutions with their own embedded biases?
I guess that's directed to both me and Rosie, so I can say something, and Rosie, then you can have the final word on it. There's so much in this question, so I don't think I'll be able to touch upon all of those things at all. But in terms of US scaling back, development sector, so there's this report that I wrote with Ingrid van Graven on the INGOs, the international NGOs in development sector and stuff. I mean, one thing is, of course, the fact that USAID and stuff has been withdrawn is quite disastrous for various countries in today's structure. But one is also just like how this whole language of aid and the whole architect of aid is developed, right? It's almost like, I don't know, there's, when President Truman comes after the decolonization movements are undergoing in various countries in Asia and Africa, particularly Asia, actually, President Truman is talking about that there are 4 points of development that, he's talking about various points, and the point 4 is that on development, which is like the first time in a big international forum, the idea of development, the way we understand it today, where, some countries are already developed and others are not, and hiding away the role of colonialism, etc., is sort of made very apparent. And that's what happens in what is called the President Truman's fourth point, so to say. And in there it says, again, I'm paraphrasing, but that how we need to make our gains of scientific progress, etc., available to the rest of the world, right? In this very charitable way of as if, they just happen to have all this abundance. It wasn't dependent on everything that we have been talking about. And that's where also the role of aid, etc., comes into being. And of course, there are various forms of aid, tied aid, which in fact might not help the country to which the aid is given, so on and so forth. So, and all these NGOs and civil society, etc., that was aligned with that was basically done in a way where earlier during periods of colonialism, it kind of even became a vehicle of promoting colonialism. And after that, when it didn't, the entire architect didn't really undergo that change. It was that very Eurocentric vision that continued with it. So in that sense, one has to be skeptical about it. But given the architecture is in a way, of course, this taking away of aid is likely to have disastrous consequences. So you're absolutely right in asking that, does that open vacuum in space? Frankly, I don't know, because the things that are being rolled back by the US are not the aspects of globalized financial capital that we've sort of been, Rosie and I both have been sort of talking about. Those things, sure, there's tariffs on goods, etc. But finance capital is still as global. And, this emergence of the big companies, how much they're controlling everywhere in the world, is still sort of very, very dominant. Having said that, this is probably for any of us who were probably born in the 90s and many of you later and just in the preceding decade, it's probably one of the most politically charged, but also one of the point in history which is impregnated with most possibilities of change. Which direction we're able to push it in, we do not know. And of course, the biggest thing that's happening in today's, at least I think the biggest thing that's happening more than Trump and everything that's been going on, is the Palestine moment, right? And that in that context, we cannot think of the structuring of globe in the rules-based international order that came into being post the Second World War. We cannot go back to a pre of this. I really do not think so, because that's the turmoil that we're going through, where all our ideas of how world is supposed to be structured, how legalities are supposed to be structured, how it's a sanitized system of development has really broken apart. So we have to somehow find ways to be able to identify whether we can move in a more just direction, or whether the other form it will take is to extremely populist right-wing agenda towards much more unequal and towards much more ostracization of minorities, etc. So we do not know, but it is, the moment with most possibilities.
Yeah, I really don't have a lot to add. I think, Serbia has put that in words that are far better than anything I can offer. But I will just echo that. I think, in the immediate term, I am concerned about what the withdrawal of US aid funding means for access to medicines in many countries, access to critical medicines in many countries. And that probably isn't being discussed enough, right? And that it should open also other questions about dependence of or why some country, why there is such a dependence on US and aid for access to medicines in many countries. But that's what I'm kind of most concerned about in the short term, right? But I think it's inevitable that we will see. And again, I don't like to make predictions about what's going to happen, but I think, as Serbia has also suggested, it is inevitable that we're entering, or we're already in, a period of kind of dramatic reconfiguration of the global economy, of relations between states, of the relation between states and markets and people and the planet that we are living on and burning. I would like to be optimistic about this being a moment of potentiality for transformation, but I think it could in a positive way. But I'm equally concerned about the endurance of genocides in places like Palestine, and the election of right-wing and fascistic politicians in many parts of the world as well, that might suggest we're not going in that way, but or in those directions. Yeah, so just to echo exactly what Somi said in less eloquent words, I think.
Amazing. Thank you for the answers. Yeah, as you said, this kind of the transformation periods are open the different directions for the not the political history, but also for the societies, for the economic directions, could have the different chances or not. That's the up to how the directors or the presidents will handle with or not. We are so thankful for your attendance, for all of the attendees, and I'm so thankful for my personal thankful for the Thais, Rosie, and Subri. We are so happy to see you, and also thankful for your contribution to create a different kind of the complex two topics into the bar to talk about with the nada awkward dance movements. I think that our dance create a different kind of the harmony to understand the between theory and the reality in that structure. So for the attendees, you will see a feedback question on your screen. Please, we will wait for your feedback structure.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. It was really fantastic. And thank you, Rosie. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all. Thanks, Surbi, and everyone for joining, and of course our wonderful organizers. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much.